Hello, this is David Perlman for Conversations at the WholeNote. My guest today is Sterling Beckwith. Very pleased to have you here.
It's great to be here, David. I'm a great fan of WholeNote. I think it's what culture is all about, really.
Thank you. We'll keep that one, I think. So May 13 and 15 is the immediate context for this particular chat. Toronto Symphony Orchestra, Shostakovich 13, the Babi Yar Symphony.
Right.
And wanted you to come in to talk about it, not just about it, but why you would want to talk about it.
Well,
which is more interesting, perhaps,
yes,
even than just about it.
It's an amazing work, and I've been nervously and excitedly awaiting this performance all year. As soon as I heard about it, still wondering whether it's going to live up in some ways. I'm sure the music will be wonderful and the orchestra is marvelous, but I'm wondering if it will really connect with our audience. It's a piece that I've had a hankering to get connected to ever since I was privileged to be an exchange research scholar in the Soviet Union way back in the 60s.
Yep.
A few months, in fact, I arrived a month after the first performance of this symphony in Moscow.
Which was December 18, 1962.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That is correct. And I arrived in January of 63.
Okay.
I was assigned, this was a part of the official academic exchange, and I was, since my topic had to do with Russian choral culture, I was attached to the choral department of the then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg Conservatory. And I've soon found out that the choir of the school was looking forward eagerly to participating in the Leningrad premiere of this new Shostakovich symphony, which, as you know, is one of the most unusual choral works ever written, because it was written entirely for Russian basses.
Right.
And being a bass myself, I was assured that I would probably be asked to join the chorus.
Wow.
And this was going to be a tremendous, unexpected highlight of my stay in Soviet Union. So, unfortunately, that performance never took place.
Let me read something just to set the scene. This is actually a review that Bruce Surtees, who writes for us, wrote in October 2014. The re-release of the Kirill Kondrashin Moscow Philharmonic.
That was the first one.
Performance.
Yes, the first performance.
So this is what he wrote, and it's interesting because it tells the story to some extent, and then you can pick it up from there.
Beautiful.
He says, on December 18, 1962, defying admonitions from Premier Khrushchev and the Soviet Presidium, the first performance of Shostakovich's 13th Symphony was given in Moscow and dutifully ignored by the press. The composer had set 5 of Yevgeny Yevtushenko's poems, including the recently published Babi Yar, the subject of which was anti-Semitism, and the well-documented wholesale massacre of Jews in Kiev by the Nazis in World War II. Further performances were banned until Yevtushenko altered the text, which he did, but not before December 20, when there was a repeat performance with the original text. And this CD with Kondrashin conducting and Vitaly Gromadsky
right.
performing was this particular recording. So that's a brief synopsis of
those performers, by the way, both conductor and soloists, were not the ones originally scheduled to do the premiere.
Interesting.
Both the bass soloist and the conductor, Mr. Mravinsky, a very well-known and magnificent conductor, eventually felt obliged to withdraw their services rather late in the day from the world premiere, and Kondrashin and Gromadsky were able to step in, and so that it was very much of a last-minute substitution, because the pressure apparently had already been on ever since the poem itself. And of course it was all about the poem, not about the music in this particular case. I suspect most musical censorship really, in Russia at least, and probably elsewhere too, is really about the words.
About the words.
And but in this case, the words are the music.
Okay.
The music exists only and very powerfully to project those particular words that Shostakovich himself assembled after first reading the Baba Yar poem and realizing that this is something he wanted to set, and setting it, and then saying, why don't I make this into a larger work, which he decided to call a symphony at some point.
I was going to ask, what would you call it?
I would call it a civic oratorio or something like that, really. But even that is, or cantat, something like that. It's really for a powerful male, no-nonsense singer to deliver the text, backed up by a cheering section. And the choir is really his support, his cheering section. Occasionally, they take part in some of the events that are being recounted. They become participants briefly. But most of the time, they're commenting on it, and a lot of the time, they're simply echoing and reinforcing what the singer is actually saying. So they're really his connection, and the whole idea, of course, is to say this is the people talking through the singer, and with the backup of this crowd of other singers.
So Shostakovich is out of the doghouse that he went into after Lady Macbeth of
that was in 36,
under
of
Stalin,
course.
all the way back in 36. He's out of the doghouse. And he grabs this bone and starts to shake it. Not only is he out of the
doghouse, but the whole country is, in a way, beginning to feel that it is now
entitled.
It is now out of the doghouse. The thaw really was quite pervasive in many ways, and more kinds of things were happening culturally all over the place. And you're right, this is Opus 113, the 13th Symphony. Opus 114 is the newly revised and retitled version of Lady Macbeth.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Katerina Izmailova.
So what possesses him?
Which was also able to be produced for the first time since 1936 in Russia. Just that in that magic year of 62. Also the year, by the way, that Stravinsky finally went home to Russia.
So did this get him in trouble again?
It certainly did. It certainly did. They of course, had compelled the revisions in the text that had to be made. But what happened, I suppose, was that by the time of the Leningrad premiere, they had not yet. You have to check. They had not yet complied, And I think, therefore, they said, okay, we're going to yank that.
So in this performance are we getting the original
We're getting
text
the original text because,
for the choir and the bass soloist?
Yes, we are. Because, however, the choir is going to be using a score which happens to have the doctored text for the soloist in it. Because it's a score that was published later under official Soviet auspices. But the score that the orchestra is using was published in Germany, based on the score that was either smuggled out or somehow brought out at the time of the Moscow premiere.
So the soloist for this one is who?
He is as far as I know, he is a young, rising young basso who is now on the roster of the Bolshoi Opera in Moscow.
Okay.
He's done a lot of good work. He's also, I believe, a graduate of my alma mater, Leningrad, the St. Petersburg Conservatory, as is the conductor, Andrei Boreyko, who was trained in the same choral department that I was earlier attached to. So I'm looking forward to meeting him for the first time and maybe even exchanging anecdotes.
I listened to a version of this on YouTube with Gergiev and I've forgotten which orchestra. It wasn't Concertgebouw, it was a European orchestra, and they were using even at this point, they were using the censored text.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Not the original. And I was wondering if that's, well, I don't know what that has to do with.
I don't know either, and it'd be very interesting. And I'm assuming that what I told you is correct because I know what score the conductor is using.
Right.
And I know what score the orchestra is using.
Okay.
But I don't really know what score the soloist thinks he's going to use.
Interesting. And I mean, just to fill in the context, I mean, this is fairly new to me, but my sense of it was that the poem as originally written was absolutely rooted in people of the Jews, it's Egypt, and that the revisions had to do with more of a mother Russia, and it wasn't only Jews who died there, and
that was the main thrust of the revisions, at least.
So that was where the agitation
for the first
came?
poem, and
the second poem.
It's interesting because the entire piece begins with this powerful statement. On Babi Yar, there are no monuments.
Right. Which was true until 1976.
Which was true for a good while, but it isn't entirely true that no attempt was ever made to commemorate it. I've recently discovered. Apparently there were various efforts after the war to come up with some kind of a suitable memorial within Ukraine, and various committees of architects and designers and sculptors or whatnot were assembled and argued over what it should be. They couldn't apparently agree on something that was considered politically and ethnically and otherwise the way it should be, and so the thing never got built.
So Babi Yar itself, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, over a 3-day period in 1941 in September, almost the entire Jewish population of Kiev was rounded up, told that they were being resettled, and basically machine gunned and then buried in this ravine, which then became a slaughterhouse for 70, 80, 100,000 additional people.
It was one of the first. I'm not sure of the full chronology, but it certainly was one of the first really mass massacres, of mass murders of an entire huge accumulation of people, not just local. There were a lot of little Babi Yars all over Russia,
Right.
apparently, because there was a wonderful segment on 60 Minutes not long ago about a marvelous French priest who has devoted his life to going back to Russia and Ukraine and Moldova and trying to discover the sites where the local extinction of Jews took place, and trying to contact the few elderly survivors who may have witnessed it or known about where it was, and identifying the locations and all this business. It's an amazing work. I think I was wishing almost that segment of video from 60 Minutes could be shown as a kind of a prelude to the performance of this piece, to give the audience some sense that it isn't just another Shostakovich symphony that they're listening to, but that there's a special thing. On the other hand, I'd love to talk a little bit, if you have time, about the fact that although the symphony grew out of that poem and out of that particular very, very powerful set of recollections, it's not, first of all, a portrait of the murder of people. It doesn't really talk much about that. It uses that as a springboard. But then there are the four other poems.
Okay, so the five movements are Babi Yar. Second movement is
humor.
Humor, yeah. Third,
following the Holocaust, we have humor.
Yeah,
that's the opera composer's sense of timing coming in.
Yeah,
and then the third is in the store or at the store.
Right.
About what it takes to be a mother and a woman, and what shopping was all about in the good old days in the Soviet Union. And it's sort of a paean to motherhood and to womanhood and to the long-suffering women of Russia. And then the fourth is the poem that Shostakovich himself is said to have asked Yevtushenko to write.
Once the vision of the overall piece had fallen in place.
And that one is fears are dying in Russia.
Fears are dying.
And then it goes on to explain all the different kinds of fears that Russians had to live through. Fear of talking to strangers, fear of talking to foreigners, fear of talking to your own wife, fear of talking to yourself, lest you be overheard, and then and then it goes on and on and on to a whole catalog of fears, including some new fears which are a little bit more obscure, but they tend to blunt a little bit the idea that
they're all dying.
That they're all dying. Yes.
Interesting. So the fear of speaking the truth as an artist.
Yes, some of that is at least implied.
Right.
At least implied.
Because Brodsky, this is the time when Brodsky has been sent off to Siberia, right?
Was it really?
I think so. I think that because Shostakovich and Yevtushenko both involved themselves in lobbying for his release.
I'm sure they did.
And that was within a few years of this. It may not
guess.
So, that would make it a little prophetic,
you're right.
Right?
It couldn't be that many years because Shostakovich didn't live that much longer.
Right. And then the fifth movement.
And the fifth movement is a wonderful capstone to the whole thing, both musically and textually. It's about careerism, and about in effect, it compares the great careers of men of science and of daring who risked everything, including opprobrium, persecution, repression, and all of these things, and certainly risked the disapproval and the punishment, actually,
Right.
to stick to their guns and to discover things that were not accepted as appropriate or true. People like Galileo and some of the great writers, Shakespeare and all of these people. And the comparison is between those people and the apparatchiks
Right.
and sellouts and careerists who flourished quite comfortably throughout the whole Stalin era. And who are flourishing just as comfortably today in Moscow and in Washington and maybe even in Toronto.
Maybe. So anyone listening to this so far is potentially going to be left with the impression that this is some, didactic music in the service of a message kind of thing. But it's not like that at all as a piece of music. It's a giant bellow of...
Yes, it is.
Of itself. It's musically and incredibly
and even
powerful
textually, if you take it all together, it's saying we have come, this is what living through the Stalin era as a Russian has meant. We've had a Holocaust which we've tried to deny and suppress. We've had for the ordinary person has ordinary civilian, so to speak, the ordinary citizen has really had a rough time of it. In a sense, they've been the victims of the system, but they've also been the heroes of the system. And the real heroes have been the ordinary people who used humor to keep sane,
right?
Who kept going with their pots and pans to the grocery store to bring home a little bit of milk and a little bit of some pickles and whatnot to feed the family in the midst of famines and sieges and invasions and war. Not just Stalin, of course, they've survived, but they survived this horrendous the losses of the Second World War and everything that happened before Stalin, even the famine, the Civil War, the Revolution, all of these things Shostakovich himself lived through. And finally, there was a time things were beginning to melt enough so that you could look back at all of this and say, these are the people who really need to be celebrated. We have endured. And there are several places in the piece where he says, absolutely underlining every note, we survived all this, we will survive all this. And it's really, that's the ultimate message that I get out of the piece.
And as music?
And the music, it does everything possible to get that message across. The message really comes from the text in a way that no other work of his really does. It's the most outspoken in the sense of textual speech almost. And therefore, that has caused me a great deal of grief and work. Because I was privileged to be invited by Lydia Adams.
Oh yeah.
At the very beginning of the season, way back in September, to come and help, as I have done in the past with her group, to help them master some of the intricacies of Russian pronunciation.
Okay, and it's the Eislers and the Amadeus basses who are combining to do
plus extra,
reinforcements.
Some reinforcements.
Not easy to be Russians.
I was hoping those reinforcements would come very strategically from the Ukrainian choirs, the Russian choir, and the Jewish choirs, at least, that are in town, and that therefore the concerts themselves would be, we're we're going to hear our boys sing, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's, of course, the symphony's job, not mine and not Lydia's. So really, whether they're going to do that kind of outreach in publicizing this thing remains to be seen. So far, they haven't even mentioned, in the little bit of publicity that I've seen on the internet, they haven't even mentioned the fact that there is a soloist, not to mention who it is. But that I'm sure
It's
will
another,
come. That will
another
come.
topic. There's a month and a half
There's
to
a
go.
month and a
so
half to go.
hopefully
Let's
there'll be
see.
some
I'm looking forward to see.
momentum on
But
this.
it's crucial because all of this heavily packed meaning that we've just talked about is packed into a foreign language
Yeah,
that most of the audience won't have a clue about.
yeah.
And the symphony isn't well known for using surtitles.
Yeah, no, not likely.
It's not likely that they will, and I'm not sure they should, because it is a kind of a distraction
It can be, yeah.
when you're listening to a symphonic piece.
Yeah. But program notes is a different question.
Program notes
let's see.
is okay. At
I
least
mean,
it's a minimum.
the actual,
but nobody
the actual
reads
text.
them
Oh, I do.
while the thing is going.
No, I try to do it ahead of time. When I go to
Yes.
the opera, I also just try to do stuff ahead
Well,
of time.
they
so,
may read a little bit, but
Yeah.
it
a
somehow
tough one,
that
hey?
doesn't really get the thing.
So let's go back. Let's go
Yes.
back to you.
All right.
In
Forget
1962.
it. Yes, there I am. Yes, that was it.
How do you happen to be on a choral exchange in 1962 while
Well,
Khrushchev is hammering his shoes
Incredible.
on the
He's not only
table
hammering
at the
his
United
shoes,
Nations?
Not only hammering his shoes, but placing his missiles in Cuba pointed at the U.S.
So how does that
Yes.
come to be?
And there I was arriving in, and I discovered very quickly that none of the young Russians I started to get to know had any clue
Yeah.
that the world had almost been destroyed.
Where were you exchanging from?
I was actually in Atlanta.
You were in Atlanta?
Atlanta. My first university job was as director of choral music for Emory University, which is now the headquarters of Jimmy Carter and his whole
Right.
operation. But in those days, it had a music department that consisted of two.
Oh, yeah.
I was half of the
You were
music
half-
department.
Yeah.
And it was a marvelous experience, and I had a wonderful time in the South, and I loved Atlanta. But I applied for. I wanted to do some research into Russian choral music,
yeah.
because my undergraduate specialty at university had been Russian history, literature, and language. And at the same time, I was moonlighting as a musician.
Right.
And as a choral musician, and eventually the two interests
The two things
came
came
together.
together.
I pursued music after that, rather than going into some kind of spy work that I wasn't well suited for. Although the Russians may think otherwise, I'm not sure. But in any case, so I wrote to the Ford Foundation, and they gave me a special creative award to do two projects, one of which was this visit to Russia. And so I had a marvelous opportunity to really get from the inside, and eventually I was able to branch out and visit other parts of the Soviet Union and meet with important musicians and choral directors and whatnot, and hear wonderful music performed in Armenia and in Georgia. I was one of the people responsible. I have to claim this, although I shouldn't be bragging. One of the people responsible for the tremendous popularity of Georgian choral music in Canada and North America. I was I heard about it from some of the leading American musicologists, including my own professor, who said Georgia is a very special place. And then, of course, I heard about it a good deal once I got to the Soviet Union, and I insisted on going there and had the most marvelous time meeting with musicians and having them sing for me and taping them and doing all kinds of things, and came back totally enchanted by this amazing music that sounded like a cross between, I don't know, the latest avant-garde harmony and the 14th century polyphony and goodness knows everything in between. And it's folk music, and they sang it with tremendous gusto and with large drafts of Georgian wine, and it's amazing music. As you know, I brought it back and started playing it for people. One of the people I played it for was Noah Greenberg, who at that time was head of the New York Pro Musica Antiqua and was really at the forefront of the whole early music movement in North America. And he was about to go off on a concert tour to Russia as part of this whole cultural exchange, which included the academic exchange that I was on, and Stravinsky's visit, and the Robert Shaw Chorale, which galvanized the whole Russian choral scene, and Glenn Gould, and lots of other things.
That stuff.
So
Greenberg did Play of Daniel at the Cloisters back in those days.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And he did go to Russia, and he did go to Georgia and met the same people I did, who then became his guides throughout the whole of the Soviet Union. And he came back absolutely raving, and we met after he returned once before he died rather soon, unfortunately, after that. But we met once, and we both more or less shook hands on the fact that we were going to both learn Georgian and create a whole new Georgian choral movement in North America. He was totally captivated by
which manifests in Toronto in groups like
Darbazi and all of those people, and Alan Gasser and all of those folks.
So how close did you come to meeting Shostakovich that time?
I certainly heard him perform live, and I saw him sitting in the audience of at some rehearsal that I went to, but I never actually shook his hand or anything like that. I was afraid to. I didn't know what I would say to him, but he was there.
So let's cycle back again to 13th and the 15th.
So that symphony is something that I've felt.
It's personal.
It's personal.
This is
to
personal.
begin with, and also that the nature of what it's saying is very personal.
Yeah.
And then it happens also to dovetail with something I've been doing for the last 50 years, which is trying to make it easier for people who have no knowledge of the language to perform some of the Russian choral repertory in the original language and make it sound reasonably good and reasonably Russian. And I devised a kind of a simplified transcription system in order to make that possible. And I've been tinkering with that and publishing it and using it with various groups, the Toronto Mendelssohn Choir and the Amadeus people and a number of choirs in Canada, in Hamilton and Oakville and other places, and in the U.S. And I published a choral series actually using that method for a while. And so this was a natural. Here is a piece which is nothing without the text.
Yeah.
And in which the text is fated to be in Russian, and in which this special group of singing men is going to have to quickly learn how to make a creditable performance. As the backup group, so to speak, the cheering section for the soloist, you cannot just you cannot just mumble a sort of an approximation of
Yeah.
what the soloist just sang.
Yeah.
You have to be able to really be one of his boys, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to sound as real and as Russian as he sounds.
Yeah, well, the
And
canyon has to echo,
that's it.
not
And to
translate.
do that in one or two rehearsals
Tough.
is going to be tough.
So
Yeah. So that's where my system comes in.
Yeah.
Besides my history, the system also comes in,
Yeah.
and the two sort of converged. And I said, this piece, they've got to use
they've
me.
got to get it right.
And fortunately, it was Lydia who invited me. Otherwise,
yeah.
I would have bugged her until she did.
This is fantastic. So, starting to wrap,
Yes,
because
you begin to see.
because people won't listen if we
That's
go
right.
too long.
No, I'm going on too long.
The hope would be that, following the nature of the movements in the piece itself, that something like this can't afford to just be a careerist performance.
That's right.
It's got to get beyond just
does.
being the trappings of a symphony to saying this is actually a monumental occasion to live something through
How do you
the
do
music.
that? How do you do that?
How do we all
with a foreign
do that?
language work?
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
of course, we've come a long way, thanks to Toronto, thanks to Lotfi, and the whole idea of super titles and surtitles.
Yeah.
We've come a long way in our ability to present works that are really deeply enmeshed in their native tongue in a way that an ordinary American audience can handle it.
Yeah.
The problem with Russian is that just merely transliterating the Russian text does not give you even a reasonably correct rendition, let alone an idiomatic one, because the Russians think that their alphabet is phonetic, but it isn't.
Right.
And so that unless you actually know Russian to begin with, you
Yeah.
can't read the transliteration properly, let alone read the original. So,
And the score that came from German has done an approximation into somebody who's got umlauts in
well,
the brain.
that's true,
And you,
but it's a perfectly
it's a
decent
good one,
transliteration. But
for a
not
German speaker.
for a German speaker, or
Yeah.
for that's right. And we could have used it with a lot of adaptations and corrections. No, this really
kind
means
of
that. and all that
Rosetta
stuff.
Stone version
Exactly.
of the
So
thing.
I
yeah.
came up with this system.
other.
It remains to be seen whether my ego will be satisfied with this thing, or whether my system may also bomb. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. But I see this as the great apotheosis of this system that I've been working on for 50 years. And I hope it works.
And people should take note of the concerts and get out to
That's right.
them and
But the
open
concerts, I
themselves
think,
to the experience.
And of course,
right?
that's the other interesting question for all of us, I think. Will the work mean enough, carry enough because of the music? Which I don't think about very much, really. I'm so obsessed with the textual issues.
Yeah, and I've just been
the
listening to the
verbal
music,
issues.
and
Yeah.
it grabs
It
in the
does?
same way as
Yeah.
well. You know,
It's movie music.
it's really
Yes.
interesting because strange analogy or comparison to make, but in the same way as something like Songs of the Auvergne uses about the same pitch range
Yes,
as
right.
the person around the campfire could. It's embedded
bit
in,
more, yes.
but it's embedded in an
Yeah.
accessibility to make the
That's right.
sounds that is human rather than artistic.
I think that's a marvelous observation.
And
There's something
I
else
think it's
too.
worth
There's
getting
something
out to.
else I'd love to say if you can give me
Sure.
another moment.
Sure.
The ability to accept and absorb works that are foreign, that come from a foreign context, and that speak to that context. Nothing speaks more to the specific context than this work, and yet, therefore, I think it's also more universal, as so often happens in the arts. But that's what the arts are for. And the ability to just say, yes, of course, I'm going to go hear this symphony. It's in Russian, and that's going to be part of my experience.
Yeah.
Not to say, well, it's not my language. I can't. I don't. We don't do that. We're Canadians, you know. That's the core of what a real education is supposed to do for you. I've been very, very lucky in having that kind of an education, and I've been very lucky in getting paid for most of my life to deliver that kind of education. But it's not a kind of education that that is very, very much popular these days, and it doesn't lead to a job, unfortunately.
But it may lead to Roy Thompson Hall on May the 13th
It
and
should.
the 15th.
It should.
All
It
right.
leads to being able to share any culture as being part of your own.
Yeah.
What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. And nothing human is foreign to me. That's the result of, that's the kind of education that I think everybody needs. That's why the arts should be required courses in all of these schools that are busy training people for jobs. Otherwise, they're not getting an education. And let's hope the humanities and the arts come back to their rightful place as the key to the survival of the human race from here on in, because otherwise I don't know where we're going. There we
Thank
go.
you.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.